Welcome to this online edition of the McGill Institute for the Study of International Development Speaker Series. My name is Yann Polain. I'm an assistant professor at the Institute, and I'm the coordinator of the speaker series. This year, given the current circumstances we all know about, we are trying something slightly different than our usual talks on campus. Instead of having in-person talks, we'll be running a series of short interviews with experts in international development that we will post on the ISID website. Some of these interviews will be run by ISID professors like me, others will be run by our fantastic cohort of graduate students. The interviews will be loosely organized around the idea of resilience, a concept that has risen to prominence in recent years in the development field, and that also seems particularly relevant during this time of global crisis. So today I have the pleasure of hosting Lindsey Jones. Lindsey Jones recently finished a PhD in environmental policy and development at the London School of Economics, in which she explored the merits and limitations of subjective approaches to measuring resilience to climate variability and change. Lindsey's published several very interesting papers on the matter, which we'll be discussing today. He's also worked several years with the Overseas Development Institute in the UK, and now is employed as a senior risk monitoring analyst for the Global Crisis Risk Platform at the World Bank in Washington, DC. So welcome, Lindsey.
Hi, yeah, very excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you. So let's start with that image. I asked you to select an image for us to look at as sort of a conversation starter. And let's start with that. It's a cartoon of three formally dressed people being dropped off a plane into a mountain village with the title Disaster Relief under it. Can you tell us a bit more about why you selected that image, what it means to you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for some reason, I just love this image. I actually came across it while at a workshop with a big panel of experts, so it's somewhat ironic. But for me, this epitomizes a lot of what happens in the kind of development and humanitarian space, particularly in kind of post-disaster contexts, right? So, this is really an area where supposedly, we are very focused on supporting marginalized groups, empowering them, giving them voice. And what we usually find is that, in a sense, we defer to experts. A lot of the choices, the agendas that get set, they're very much defined, by people in the global north, by experts, so-called, that work on this space. And they dictate a lot of what happens in terms of resource allocation and just how we go about disaster relief. And for me, that was an interesting perspective. As someone who was aspiring to be an expert in this area, is from the global north, is white, is male, that it kind of troubles me a little bit in feeling a little bit uncomfortable with that, noticing, that there is this kind of, dichotomy of perspective, a missing voice, that a huge amount of power going to small groups. So for me, I've just tried, that's kind of inspired my work. It's inspired my research and how I go about trying to, to do my development practice, seeing where it's possible to kind of flip that on its head. And that's kind of inspired a bit the kind of the PhD that I did that was looking at subjective voices and how can we feed that into the agenda, and in particular, how we measure things like resilience.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So your work is approaching that notion of resilience and trying to bring that subjective measure or subjective voices into it. So before we go into that, which I do want to ask you about how you go about that. This concept of resilience has been around for a while now in different disciplines, in ecology and engineering. But it's only relatively recently that it started taking hold in international development. And now, anywhere you look, left and right, people are talking about resilience in various different ways. It's almost the new, not almost, it's very much the new buzzword. What do you think explains this rise of resilience? What's the origin of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a super good question. And I think many others are still scratching our heads as to how it's skyrocketed in terms of popularity, in terms of the amount of interest in resilience from all different sectors. So I'm not entirely sure. I think part of the reason is because resilience is approachable, right? It's a concept that we all think we know because we've heard about it. It comes from lots of different disciplines, and we talk about it in our day-to-day lives about being resilient. So it's something we can relate to much more so than, sustainable development. If we don't work in that field, we won't really know what that means. So for me, that has a big appeal, or it kind of explains a little bit as to why resilience connects with lots of different people in the same way that, happiness and well-being does, because we all have a take. We all understand from our own personal perspectives what we think happiness is. So we have an opinion, and we want to promote that. So I think part of the reason is that. The other thing is that resilience in itself is kind of a unifying concept, right? The whole point, and from a kind of programmatic perspective, right, is to draw on different types of disciplines, different timescales, bring them all into the same room and discuss how we become better at dealing with risks. And that's something that's an attractive proposition to people. I do think, though, that there's an inherent danger with that, right? That because it is so approachable, because we all think we kind of know what it is, we lead ourselves into a bit of a trap, because we're all speaking, we think we're speaking the same language, but perhaps with different dialects, right? So when I speak to an engineer, when I speak to someone outside of my field, when they talk about resilience, it's something completely different. So there is that danger that we think we're talking the same language, but actually, we really are at a disconnect.
And actually about that, what would be your way of talking about resilience? How would you define resilience in the context of international development and specifically climate risks and the kind of things you work with?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really hard question to answer.
I know.
I've spent a PhD, essentially trying to do that. But I mean, I think it's important, first of all, before defining it, to think about what is it and whose perspective are we talking about. So we can talk about resilience from, a systems perspective. We can talk about it from a household's perspective. I think we conflate a few things. At the higher level, at the kind of, operational perspective, resilience is this big buzzword where it's kind of, promoting resilience building, where we kind of bring different sectors together, right? There's resilience in that sense, right? So a resilience kind of building approach is one where you have, disaster risk reduction, humanitarian, people sitting together with longer term kind of development actors, all coming together and thinking across timescales. So that's one way of thinking about resilience. The kind of the entry point that I usually, work from is a kind of a systems perspective. So separate to that kind of programmatic way of thinking of resilience, for me, resilience is about capacities. That's how I usually see it, right? So it's promoting different capacities that help us deal with risks. Now, we can have a fight about which specific capacities should be included. I don't think that really matters too much, right? So for me, it's just about promoting the sorts of capacities that will help whatever you're interested in, whether it's a household, whether it's a community or a country, to be able to deal with risks both now and in the future. Now, obviously, then it gets difficult to think about what specific ones, and they're not all the same. Mm-hmm. So, the capacities that will help a fisher in, coastal Kenya are going to be completely different to what will help, a market trader in China or somewhere else, right? The things that will make them resilient will be completely different. But yeah, in general, from my perspective, it's about building the capacities needed to deal with some of those risks.
And the fact that the things that make people resilient will be very different is one of the reasons probably you engaged in what you call subjective approaches to measuring resilience, right? So so going back to that, and you introduced it earlier, you distinguish in your work between objective and subjective approaches to measuring resilience, and you spend quite a lot of time investigating those different approaches and developing a subjective approach or different subjective approaches in your work. Can you tell me a bit more about the differences between those approaches and what a subjective approach looks like and what's the advantages of such an approach?
Yeah, and it's a really important distinction to make. One that I think, even within the resilience measurement space, we haven't actually talked about and thought about enough, which is kind of part of why I was so keen to work on it as part of my PhD. Essentially, what I think is it's a bit of a spectrum. So there's no such thing as a fully objective measurement approach, right? There's no such thing as a fully subjective measurement approach. Even if you're, using satellites to measure changes, after a disaster, there will be some subjective elements in how you choose the variables you look at, what sort of time periods, what kind of framework you use to understand, resilience when you measure it. So there's always some degree of either subjectivity and objectivity. So that's the first kind of caveat. In general, what I would say is, from a theoretical perspective, when you think about objective resilience, objectively measuring it, there's two aspects. How do you, first of all, define resilience? And then how do you go about evaluating it? Okay, so for example, you could have a objectively defined version of resilience whereby, say, somebody else is defining what resilience is. Say it's a panel of experts, right? So it's external to whoever is being measured. So I've done this, I'm guilty of this many, many times. I've come up with my own resilience frameworks, right? And applied them to people in different countries where I know very little about too, right? So that's a very much an externally defined version of what resilience is. So I say it's these 5 capacities that make up a resilient household in Kenya. Then we have the process of thinking about how do we go about measuring it, right? And that can also be done objectively or subjectively, depending on whether it's external or internal to the person that we're measuring, right? So I could go to the household in rural Kenya and I can then measure everything in their house, right? I can pick up, the amount of assets and materials they have, lying around the house. I can figure out based on observation, whether their education levels and all the things that I think from my external perspective makes them resilient. That would be a fully, objective version. Or I could flip it on the other way and say, ask them, do they feel resilient? Right? How resilient are they to deal with lots of different types of risks? That would be a subjective approach.
Yeah.
I don't know if that, that's a,
that's
a lot of different nuance, but from a high level, it's whether the person, that you are trying to observe and measure in terms of their resilience, is it coming from their internal perspectives or is it external to them?
Right. Yeah. Well, and in a recent study that you published in Global Environmental Change, you really adopted that subjective resilience perspective, using a large-scale phone survey to get at household resilience to natural hazards, right? And ask some important questions about how resilience fluctuates over time. About that study, I'd like to first ask you how you went about setting up a phone survey of that scale, and concretely talking about subjective resilience, how was it an advantage in this case that you used a subjective framework rather than an objective framework of measuring resilience?
Yeah, so I mean, mobile phones have kind of taken over, the world in a way. The great thing about it is that with proliferation of mobile phones in developing countries across the global south, it unlocks new ways of being able to communicate and collect information, directly from them, which is kind of game changing when you think about research and surveys, right? So that study that you mentioned, that's done in Myanmar. In Myanmar, about 3, 4, 5 years ago, it would have cost you $100, to buy a SIM card in Myanmar. Now you get it for less than $1. So we've got a game changer here in being able to kind of access and communicate with people. Setting up phone surveys is not easy. It's difficult logistically. You have to think about how do you and who do you reach out to. But if you sort out some of those details, it's really, really easy then to be able to collect reliable and robust information on a kind of a repeated basis. That's the big game changer with mobile phones, right? Instead of sending out a survey team that costs a lot of money, especially in a disaster area where it's unsafe usually to go out, if you have mobile phones, you have a way of communicating with people that are on the move. Say they have moved town because of a disaster or a flood. Great way to get hold of people. So for me, this is really an exciting area, in kind of post-disaster research to be able to exploit. And it is also a game changer in terms of how cheap it is relative to sending out big survey teams, especially when you collect repeated surveys. So that was the big draw. The second thing is that when you do traditionally resilience measurement assessments, right? So FAO, or WFP, these are big organizations that do resilience measurement kind of approaches. It'll probably take you about an hour and a half to go through a full household assessment. That's way too long. Even ethically speaking, taking someone out of their day, with no financial, compensation. So for me, it was a challenge. How do we do that in designing a tool to get a snapshot of someone's resilience that hopefully can be done in 5 minutes, maybe even less, right? So it's difficult to think about. We can't do it through traditional ways. So subjective tools kind of unlock that a little bit. So it obviously comes with all the caveats that subjective information comes with. But it also means that it allows you to exploit new sources of information that we would never been able to do, through a traditional household survey.
And one of the things that you wouldn't be able to do, I think, in this case is repeated surveys over time at the large scale, right? It's really hard to reach a lot of households multiple times over a year. And I think what was interesting here is that one of the things, anyways, a lot of things were interesting about that study, but is that you were able to track fluctuations over time of how resilient people say they are, and including fluctuations over the course of a few months or up to a year. So when I read that, I thought it was quite fascinating, but also not immediately intuitive to me, because intuitively, it would seem as if resilience is a slow changing variable, one that conditions responses to hazards, but not one that is affected itself by hazards in the short term. So I would think of resilience of a household or a person as a sort of known or unknown probably quantity that determines how they're going to respond to a shock, but is external, exogenous, if you will, to that shock. So can you explain a bit more what these fluctuations over a short amount of time mean and why it's important to take them into account?
Yeah, and you know, I think this is a really important new area of kind of resilience research that we're slowly trying to unpick, you know, the temporal aspects of resilience, partly because previously, you know, these snapshots have only been possible with household surveys happening once rather than repeatedly. Right. So it's giving us new insights. From my perspective, partly it also depends on your definition of resilience and how you see it. But for me, if you think about it as a capacity, it's highly likely that we're going to have certain elements of resilience that are stable, that happen, you know, that don't change very quickly over time. And there are going to be, you know, fluctuations that happen, you know, that vary over months, maybe over weeks even, over the course of a year, that mean that you are more or less able to deal with the risk. You know, for example, we can look at a few ways. You can think about slow gradual changes. For example, you look at seasonal changes, right? So my ability to deal with a shock or a stress during, you know, the lean season, say I'm a subsistence farmer, is going to be completely different to my ability to deal with an upcoming stress, you know, during the rainy season, right? That small, you know, gradual shift will definitely be a big part of how I can deal with shocks and stresses. You can also think about it in terms of a big shock, right? We know that resilience is not only made up of assets and the things that I own, but also my social networks. It's my kind of family networks, my neighbors, how they can help me. Say, for example, you know, I'm in a household somewhere and the breadwinner in my household dies for whatever reason. All of a sudden, overnight, my resilience has shifted very, very drastically. You know, my ability to be able as a household to deal with a shock has drastically changed. So it's not, you know, for me, it's important to think about those fluctuations. Yes, there will be certain stable elements. I might still live in the same house. I might still have the same bank account. But my ability to draw on, you know, the important social networks will have vastly changed overnight. So for me, that's why it's really interesting to think about those. Again, not to say that resilience fluctuates day to day, you know, on very, very large levels, but there will be these meandering changes, I think, you know, that are important to factor in when we think about resilience.
And that can pretty much only be captured by using those subjective approaches, right? Because I think if you were trying to go with a so-called objective approach based on a certain conceptual framework and a number of variables that you would have to measure, it would be very hard to capture any fluctuation like that one, or it would be extremely resource intensive.
Right? I think it's a lot harder. Yeah, you're right. So yeah. I think we are lazy as resilience measurement specialists traditionally, right? We just go with what's easy. Obviously, assets are the easiest thing to measure, right? So I go to a household and I'll look at the floor, I'll look at the roof, I'll look at the type of house, I'll see how many cats, how many, you know, cows and goats and all that they own, and put that into a big score. But you know, while that's easy, again, for me and for you know, many people, especially with a qualitative background, you know, the importance of the social networks of kind of these the social capital that people have is almost more important than the assets you own. How you measure that quantitatively is so hard because you can't see it, right? You can even measure, you know, you can measure your number of Facebook friends, you can measure the, you know, your profiles that you have or whatever, but it's not going to give you a true accurate reflection of the depth and the quality of your social networks and capital.
So is there even a place in going forward in trying to understand people's resilience to hazards, natural hazards especially? Is there a place for objective approaches, or do you think we should kind of phase them out and subjective approaches are really the way to go? After studying that for a few years, obviously you've advocated for subjective approaches, but when do you think we should use one versus the other, or should we just kind of transition to subjective approaches overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a danger. I mean, I'm probably the biggest proponent of, along with a few others, for subjective tools, because I think there's a huge value add, but I in no way see them as replacing entirely objective tools. I think they add a huge amount of benefits, where especially where we struggle. The social capital, quick rapid assessments that we might need, tracking fluctuations over time. These are things that we can't do through a traditional kind of hour-long objective approach. But that doesn't mean that the objective ones have no value. They have a tremendous amount of value, especially, like I said, if resilience is made up of different components, tracking the stable elements, which largely are, to do with assets, that's a very good way of doing it through a household survey. It could be that the more kind of fluctuating perspectives that happen over time, then subjective tools do add to that. So for me, what I would prefer is almost we have a hybrid. Right, so designing tools that have elements that include measurements of assets and things we can see and measure, but also incorporate within them subjective elements too. So we're kind of combining the two into a hybrid measurement tool. For me, that's the next step.
Right, and potentially having the objective part being done at a lesser frequency than the subjective part, or something like that.
Yeah, for sure.
That's very interesting. Really, really fascinating. Maybe to wrap it up, you've now started to work at the World Bank. How does your experience thinking about resilience help you what you're doing today? Does it matter? Are you using it, or is it something that that you've left aside?
Yeah, I mean, it's also quite ironic, right? The one, I guess, the one organization that is usually bashed for being quite top down is the one that I immediately head to. But for me, so I'm a risk analyst at the bank at the moment, and essentially what I'm doing for the bank in the immediate term is helping them to design kind of monitoring tools, early warning monitoring tools for compound disaster risk, right? So it's figuring out where are there countries and areas where there are more than one risk occurring at the same time. So it's not it's not an immediate translation of the same roles and skills. But what I'm hoping to do in designing these systems is to actually incorporate bottom-up voices as possible where possible. So it's been in the news quite a lot. The World Bank, in response to the COVID pandemic, launched a huge wave of mobile phone surveys, right? So they wanted to get a good sense of on the ground what's happening in terms of people's households' ability to deal with, shocks and stresses now that COVID is really decimating a lot of lives. And now, so part of that is kind of merging the macro level quantitative data with some of these qualitative insights to give us early warnings around, where are we expecting compound risk? So that's part of my challenge is taking some of those insights that I had from the PhD and from this resilience measurement work, putting it into those models and thinking about how to do it in a way that, that gets, big formal institutions like the bank to start thinking about some of this subjective data.
Right. Okay. Really interesting to see also examples of how you can take your PhD materials and bring it to organizations and to the real world, so to say. Although your PhD was very much already in the real world. So, well, okay. Well, that's all super interesting. Thank you so much, Lindsey. So that was it for our first interview of the ISID Speakers series. You can find links to the work we discussed today in the chat if you're interested. We'll be coming up with more interviews on the ISID webpage, so stay tuned. Thanks so much, Lindsey. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Yann. Thoroughly enjoyed.